I'll just make a few quick remarks and just some thoughts about reflections on globalization, I guess, in the context of the other research projects that are part of rebuilding macroeconomics. To me, what's interesting, I guess, about globalization when I stand back from it is it seems to be one of the hardest areas to pin down, but simultaneously one of the most interesting and the most important. And one of the things I find very intriguing as a theme within globalization is that it's being framed in a sense as the cause of a lot of the political tensions that we've currently got, which we've already been discussing. My preference is not to use the word populism. I see it more, as we discussed earlier, as a kind of continuity of an age-old form of group motivation around tribalism, which I think has been reignited for a whole host of reasons. What I think, though, is extremely interesting is if you look, for example, at the anthropological literature, actually trade is the antithesis of tribalism. So what's very intriguing is if you think of globalization really as being interdependence and trade and the market, which I would say is a reasonable starting point, it's in a particular context of applying trade to the interaction of nation states, but it's still trade, which is why virtually every issue that arises in globalization can also be an issue at a local and national level, which is something we've discussed. The interesting thing is anthropology thinks of trade as the opposite to these tribes. So actually we should be thinking that globalization is our solution, not the cause of our problem. And why is that? Well, what's very interesting, if you look at anthropology, the function of markets is actually conflict resolution. The function of markets isn't what we read in the economic textbook or how economists are trained. So I've taken a couple of interesting quotes here. The first one is from the great French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, which is to say, to trade we must first put down the spear. So this is taken from, I think it's The Gift from memory. So he's, of course, studying gift exchanges, and he's making the point that at some point between tribes there is a recognition that actually there's beneficial exchange, and in order to engage in beneficial exchange you have a form of conflict resolution that is non-violent, because the other form of interaction between tribes is pretty much violence. And he of course documents how quickly exchange can turn into violence between tribes. But I also think it's more profound than that, because if we think of it in an economic sense, actually the benefits of trade accrue precisely because we are different, and that's what's really interesting. In other words, if we were all the same, there would be no benefits from trade. So the irony, in a sense, is that we need difference in order to engage in trade. The second quote I'm kind of intrigued by, given some of the comments we've had earlier. If I'm sure many people know where it's from, but I'm interested to know how many people know who it's from. But I'll just read it out because, again, I think it's a fascinating quote. The rapid improvement of all instruments of production by the immensely facilitated means of communication draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls. We've been talking about China, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary description. I don't know if does anyone know where it's from, or does everyone know where it's from? Marx. Anyone gonna? Marx. It's Marx. Do we know where Marx? It's from the Communist Manifesto. And it actually reads very contemporary and quite prescient, really. But of course, what's very, we've alluded to, I have to say I've found the discussion so far very Marxian, so I was quite pleased that I had this in here, because we kind of have an issue of economic determinism explaining our politics, of which I'm very, very skeptical that it is about economic determinism. We've had our attempts to reconfigure the class structure, and we're observing how technology determines the structure of society, which is all pretty much textbook Marx. Right, so in that sense, to me, this subject is the most interesting, because I think tribalism and identity is the battleground that we're really fighting over. And I entirely agree with the comments that are saying that I think we live in a world that's hugely fertile and is dying for new policies. And this is one of the things that the ESRC is very focused on, that we want this research to result in innovative policies. I think there are lots of innovative policies out there. whether it's idea of universal basic income, which could be relevant, or how one wants to frame that, whether it's to do with sovereign wealth funds. But yeah, we need to have policy innovation in this area, and it is extremely important. Can I just go to the next slide? Yeah, why is it the hardest issue though? And I think this really poses a very, very substantial challenge to a research program. So my reservations, which I suspect many of you will share, is globalization too big, ill-defined, and very hard to come up with serious policy prescriptions. So again, we can end up, designing global architectures with, what's our probability of success? That we're going to get alignments of interests around very, very conflicting power structures. I think one area when one's thinking about policy prescription is not nearly enough emphasis goes into this point about by what criterion should you assess a policy. And I think that's what one should always answer that question before thinking of policies. There's no point in coming up with fantastic policies that have zero probability of being implemented. The criteria to analyze a policy or its merits are, first of all, does it stand a chance? Which is an interesting question in of itself. What makes a policy likely to be adopted is a very interesting question. And the second one is its impact. Ideally, we want to be pushing on open doors with high impact. Those are the supreme ends of any policy objective. I do think framing plays a huge role here, and that's one of the things I think where research can reframe some of those issues. And I really want to concentrate on that issue, because I think it's very important that we don't just go over the well-covered areas of globalization. We don't want to just be repeating tired arguments or extending existing arguments, but there needs to be a reframing of what people mean by globalization, how they understand globalization, how it's relevant to them. Is it too big? It covers such a wide area. We've trade in goods and services, capital flows. I think this area though is more interesting. I'm actually think it's more novel to think about the globalization of ideas and beliefs. Maybe I'll say a little bit more about that. Is it well defined? I mean, this is sort of slightly obvious problem, and again, I think we've come up with it. Maybe one doesn't need to get too hung up on this issue, because I think it's inevitably probably the case that a lot of the issues that are going to be addressed under the subject of globalization pertain at a local level, whether it's migration, income inequality, the points that were made earlier about the uncertainty of economic conditions and the labor market. But it's worth being aware of that and reflecting on it. I mean, this sounds like sort of American management speak, be ambitious and humble. I don't intend that. I think the only point is that I am encouraged by the potential for policy change. So I mentioned this point earlier about how the IMF has shifted, but I do think it is an area where one shouldn't be defeatist about the scope for policy innovation, because this is a very fertile time where, I also think there's just a dearth of innovative ideas, and so there is an appetite for policy innovation. Do we have the final? Yeah, here we go, the final slide. So I've mentioned the point about globalization as a form of conflict resolution, which again I think is a very interesting question. It's very interesting the way we've framed the discussion today of these two great competing powers, China and the United States. We don't really frame it in the context of the counterfactual. Would that be a much worse problem if they weren't economically and financially integrated? I mean, again, I find it very interesting, the whole current position on trade is the extent of interdependence and complexity creates a huge incentive structure for relatively benign cooperative outcomes. So again, I think the role of globalization in conflict resolution needs to be thought of. The fight over resources, much better for resources to be distributed in a market than the thugocracy alternative. But the thing I think is perhaps a lot more interesting and under-researched is the area of ideas. And again, this goes to the heart of how do we actually understand globalization correctly? So if you ask people in the UK, has globalization been good or bad for you? They don't say, well, actually, when I go into Boots the chemist, most of the selection that's available to me is thanks to globalization, because actually I free ride off American R&D in the pharmaceutical industry whenever I upgrade my iPhone or my iPad or my computer, or whenever I go to school, or whenever I learn. I'm effectively taking global ideas. And I think this is a very, very interesting question. If we think about, what is the effect of a trade dispute in our economy, that's a very different question to what the effect of globalization is, because we're carrying ideas. And I think this is very complex, is much more complex. So again, people think of China doing R&D as somehow a threat. China doing R&D sounds like a fantastic boon to the global economy to me, because there are huge externalities. And even if you look at the whole, all this IP dispute between America and China is a complete distraction. I mean, all corporates are cheating and lying and robbing, IP off each other all the time. That's called competition. We have huge problems with intellectual property rights and what the optimal quantity is. But if you just get hundreds of billions of dollars going into R&D, we're all going to be massive beneficiaries. So why, when we think of globalization, don't we think of globalization in R&D and science and ideas? But I don't think it's not a one-way street. I think there's another area, which is the correlation of beliefs, which I think is much more pernicious. And I actually think this is an issue between academia and independence of thought. I worry about the correlation of beliefs globally. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing that we send off Chinese policymakers start getting trained in US universities. It's not at all obvious to me that that's a good idea, because I'm not sure that the ideas coming out of US universities are particularly insightful. I find them very conventional and correlated. And what's interesting is if you have, the irony is, much more diversified thinking may well be much more productive of innovative ideas, which again creates a tension between our desire to have these kind of international orders, the kind of European sense of let's harmonize. Well, we don't get experimentation if you all harmonize. So the distribution of beliefs, the globalization of practice, corporate behaviors, these are huge areas, I think, which are very interesting and arguably under thought of. I have some ideas in terms of the impact of labour markets, again, is an interesting thing to think about, where we have integrated labour markets, which has been viewed very negatively, but arguably that actually provides you insurance against local economic cyclicality. I mean, that's a large part of what happened in the UK labour market. It's not unimaginable to me that at some point in the future, if I was an English worker, I might not want to have the opportunity of going to work in Poland, which is operating at full employment and rising real wages. So again, the nature of interdependence is more complex. And maybe a final point, which I still think is a weakness in an awful lot of macroeconomic research that I receive, is I still find it's very US-centric. And that there's a lot more to learn from cross-sectional analysis. So even if you take something, like the secular stagnation debate, you don't get many people analyzing Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan has had a huge decoupling of its domestic real interest rate structure relative to its real GDP growth rate. For decades now, it's had virtually a zero interest rate with real GDP growth rates of 5 or 6%. So I think, and if we've already discussed places like Central and Eastern Europe, so I'm very optimistic in the sense that I think research into this area can really open our eyes. So in conclusion, it's clearly a very difficult area. I think there are huge challenges in constructing a kind of coherent research program, but I have absolute faith in everybody involved. So I'm looking forward to the output.
Thank you.